Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture. Brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table. We discuss issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell, Bock, Executive Director of Cultural Engagement for the Hendricks Center here at Dallas Theological Seminary. And our topic today is human trafficking. And my very special guest, is Mike Bartel of F.R.E.E. International, who's come in from Las Vegas to be with us. We did a podcast earlier with him in which he was here over Skype. And this time we brought him right here in the flesh. So
3D.
Really pleased to have you. Mike, why don't you begin by telling us how in the world does a pastor, because I understand you have pastoral background, end up in a ministry on human trafficking?
Well, that's a good question. I come from a rich history of ministers in my family. And my grandmother was a church planter during the Great Depression into World War II. And that's really what we thought we'd be doing. And I guess what really began to draw us into this is when we were engaging with international students as campus pastors at Purdue University. It was in the day-to-day mix of working with them, hearing what was going on in their own culture and their own countries, that this issue came on our plate. It was January of 95. Mm-hmm. And it was, like all of us, it's kind of one of those moments when you can't believe what you just heard. We get that response with a lot of people with trafficking, and it was so seared in our head. I mean, we never felt like God was calling us full-time to it. Whatever that might mean at the time, but it became an exploration, a place of prayer for my family, place of prayer for our churches as we move forward, and just got to a point where we really felt God was saying, hey, this is an area that needs to be engaged, and we stepped into that space.
So it says you're co-founder, so is your wife the part two, or is that someone else?
Yeah, no, that's my gorgeous wife. Her and I together, actually, as we put this burden on the plate of those in our life who we trusted, were spiritual mentors, we were seeking God's direction, and it was really through our being open and honest and vulnerable with those we trusted with our life that they kind of put this on our plate for us.
So F.R.E.E. International, tell us about that as an organization. How long have you been around, and what do you seek to do?
Yeah, we actually started a full-time work in missions with human trafficking in Southern Asia with another organization. And through the course of what that all entailed and interacting with the churches here in the United States and an understanding of the problem of trafficking here in the States, we decided to come back, and we started F.R.E.E. International back in 2007. It focuses on the States. It focuses on trafficking of all sorts in the States, both sex trafficking of minors and adults, labor trafficking, those things that would overlap with that, as well as international trafficking. So the international piece to F.R.E.E. right now is actually from our work overseas. We have an international network of organizations, faith-based organizations and missionaries that work with us on a day-to-day basis, and we collaborate at an international level to be effective. So,
now, most people, if they think of sex trafficking in particular, will think about international sex trafficking. It certainly is my exposure. My original exposure was in Thailand. I made a visit to a ministry. We ended up in a church talking about church ministries. Totally unprepared. I was totally unprepared for this, and the major church ministry outreach that they had was in this area of rescuing people out of sex trafficking. And so they think, well, that happens over there, but that's not the case, is it?
Yeah. Well, there's definitely different places in the world because of theological structures and cultural things that this issue is more evident, like India dealing with the caste system and different things like that. Thailand, 16%, upwards of 16% of their whole economy is based on commercial sex industry.
Wow.
But it affects every country of the world, every country, including the United States. And just like in the United States, there's different places in our country where it might be a little more evident than others, like Las Vegas, where we're based, would look different than Des Moines, Iowa. But it's not a matter of if it exists there or not. It's just a matter of knowing how to recognize it, considering, the cultural pieces that fall into play, whether you're Midwest or coastal or whatever it might be.
So what exactly does your ministry do? I mean, what is it? You've got, I think you said 26 people who work for you in the ministry. What are they, coordinators? How does it work?
Yeah, we actually, when we started, it was just my wife and I, and we were building a reputation for our ability to do the work and be competent, but also how collaborative we are. And our focus was on the local church. So we believe that God called a people out of darkness into light, his church, capital C, to reach this world, small and great alike. In a pragmatic context, that means the local church. What does that look like in each community? We begin to resource empower that and begin to see effectiveness. And the more people who had a unique call on their own life to work with this issue, they saw how effective we were and how collaborative we were and inclusive we were in our work within the faith community. And so they decided to jump on. So really in the last 2.5 to 3 years, our team has grown to the size it is. And they're all missionaries, so they're all self-funded. Even though F.R.E.E International is its own not-for-profit, each person on the team is self-funded. And that allows us a great mobility, great flexibility, great creativity, and our partners love us because we're not angling for the same money that they do to exist. And so that's the context to which F.R.E.E is. We're a missions organization, but we work to find, rescue, embrace, and empower victims of human trafficking and forced prostitution.
Okay, let's work through let's work through that acronym. Find. That's the most obvious thing, I think, to someone who thinks about this kind of ministry. I guess the question is, where do you find? Well, let me start with some basic questions. What's the average age of someone who ends up being entrapped in sex trafficking?
Well, the stats that our government uses, that's largely believed is anywhere between 11 and 14 years old. So 13, 14 years old is the average age of a girl when she's first commercially exploited for sex. So for it to be trafficking, there has to be some sort of commercial exchange, some sort of monetary value, in the acquiring of that sexual act. And so between 13 and 14 years old.
That's amazing. And so you're dealing often with runaways? Is that the most common, or
well,
are there other?
It's all the above, but obviously some of the most vulnerable are the kids who are living on the street, the runaways. 2,200 to 2,300 kids are reported missing every day in this country. There's more than that go missing. Those are the ones that are just reported. But within 48 hours, 1/3 have been approached by a pimp trafficker, 2/3 within 72 hours. On top of just the exploiters, you look at, especially the boys, they end up, trading sex for a place to stay or, a meal or whatever it might be.
And that's actually what I was going to ask next, is how do they get entrapped?
Yeah, well, that's one way it works. That's their way to survive their environments, because any 14-year-old on the street's vulnerable. They can't get a car, can't get a job. They're vulnerable, and they're easy to spot when they're out on the street. And so those who would be predators seek them out in that way. But those aren't the only ones that are vulnerable. I mean, the number one risk factor for somebody who ends up sex trafficked is a self-esteem issue. And so, and this isn't meant to cause fear. It's just for instance, if a pimp is looking to recruit in a mall, he'll look for a group of 3 girls and focus on that third wheel of the group. And man, your eyes are beautiful. And if she doesn't have a stable family environment or an absentee father, or, any number of things there's a foothold for that exploiter to work that into something that benefits him financially.
Okay, so one place you find them is on the streets. Where else are the places where you might locate?
If we're dealing with labor trafficking, other ways, with the refugees that are coming in and the immigrant camps, there's a vulnerability out there among the ladies. Oftentimes those who are from other countries brought in are both labor and sex trafficked. And so to appease, a certain population of men in those immigrant communities, young girls might be used in that environment. You can look on the labor side too, and look at the hospitality industry and knockoff goods that are being sold, and door-to-door magazine. You'll see kids and people from other countries that are selling magazine subscriptions door-to-door. We've worked cases where that was a human trafficking case. And so those aren't always the case, but those are some vulnerable environments. Any commercial sex club, strip clubs, other places around there, you'll find vulnerable populations. On the
labor side, does the fact that someone might be undocumented make them vulnerable? Is that part of what?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like any 14-year-old on the street is vulnerable, anyone who is here doesn't have legal status in this country they're vulnerable. Even if we had the best laws in the world to adjust for that, oftentimes those who are being brought in from other countries don't know how America works. They only know how things worked in their own country. So the process of exploitation in that country, those assumptions are used against them to keep them enslaved here. And so not only that, but oftentimes those who are brought into this country who are trafficked came here legally. But the people who brought them in then take their papers. So they're without their passport, they're without whatever their legal status is, and then that's used against them as well.
Wow. So that's fine. Next is rescue. What's involved in that?
Yeah, rescue. Actually, we're moving away from the term rescue because it becomes a loaded term. We are not a vigilante organization. And we've always explained rescue as holistic. So in the explanation, rescue works perfect. But we're moving to the other word, which is restore, which is really what we mean by rescue anyway. A holistic healing, spiritually, emotionally, physically, the education piece, all those things that many of us typically have gone through in our life that allow us to be the person we are that's been removed from these children's life. In this life of exploitation, we try to move down that process of healing by ministering in each areas of their life.
And that's actually a pretty serious move because it's going to take time to bring that restoration because of what it is the person's been through, issues of trust, et cetera.
Yeah, it really takes a lifetime. I know in the past, we work with one of my favorite organizations in the world is Teen Challenge. And I remember early on in their existence, as I read their history, there wasn't space for them to really exist within the faith community because it was seen as a social work, and the church doesn't do social work. But what happened in the process of that is these people were coming, they were coming to church. God was ministering to their need at the altar, and they would say, "I was addicted, but now I'm not anymore," which is great. Those stories are awesome. But in the sense of restoration of somebody that's been sex trafficked or however that looks, I've never seen a case where there's this instantaneous healing, and oftentimes I think it is because there was never a normal place in their life to begin with. They don't have a place to go back to even know what a healthy relationship is, what healthy community is, what love is. Because oftentimes the very people who God called out to protect them, the father, was either the one who exploited them or was absent. And so it takes a long process of healing to begin to, show and model and pour into their lives healthy relationships to begin with.
So the next E is embrace. Is that right?
Embrace.
Okay. Yeah. And what's involved in that?
Embrace is really tied to just meeting those immediate felt needs. I've done some disaster relief work with some friends of mine. A hurricane comes through town, everything's destroyed. Families, what they need first and foremost is a bottle of water, is some extra clothes and a cot to sleep in while all this disaster gets sorted out and repaired. And just like restore, that's a long-term process. So with us, when we look at embrace, it really just a matter of meeting somebody's immediate needs. For instance, there was a few years ago with a friend of mine, we worked a situation to get a girl out. She was 26 years old. She had been out on the street, prostituted by pimps since she was 13, so half her life. She wanted out. She called my friend. He called me because I was close by. I went to get her, and when I picked her up, she had a trash bag about that big, and all it had in it was some lingerie her pimp bought her, and then the soap and the shampoo from the hotel she worked because he would never provide any of those personal items for her. And so that's all she had in her life. 26 years old, she had this trash bag full of stuff. So as part of that process, I wouldn't say a trust-building process, not healing process, but trust-building process, we went and, like some churches gave some gift cards. We went shopping with her as far as some ladies did to help her, mentor her, love her, choose clothes that didn't accent what was for sale anymore, but that showed her dignity and who she was, and just provided those immediate needs for her. And it's through that process that she entered into a relationship with Christ and a long-term approach to healing.
Now, I think I've heard you mention that the number of beds that are available to take care of people caught in sex trafficking is a pretty low number, that there isn't much available, so that when you go to meet these needs, there really is not much of an infrastructure of support around it.
Yeah, that's right. One of the big gaps in service is oftentimes there needs to be a demarcated space for some of these girls to heal, even if they come out of loving families. So, we look at that same kind of thing oftentimes with, say, a man or a woman who's come home from war and lost friends, and that no matter how much that family loves them, there's space that needs to be addressed that needs a high level of competency and some time away. And so shelters in this country, when we first started, there was, for minors, for under 18-year-old, there was less than 50 beds in this country set aside for a restorative care of girls who'd been trafficked. That number in the last 7 years has only increased slightly to around 200 beds in the whole country.
That's the whole country. I mean, think about that. That's 4 beds per state, if you want to think of it that way.
For thousands upon thousands of people who need it. Now, I'll say this too, as awareness has come into play with what this looks like and groups that have engaged it, the number of people who need those beds has increased. The reason there were so few beds is it wasn't being identified, it wasn't being engaged. And now the beds so far are behind on really what the awareness is to engage. We were given a property that we're at the end of developing. It's going to be 20 beds administered to girls between 10 and 16 years old who were either recovered and they were being prostituted, or they were put through kiddie porn. But it's a heavy lifting process. So over the course of those 7 years, shelters have come and gone because it's such a resource heavy thing to do. And other groups who have started homes didn't have necessarily the best network in place to address the trafficking side of this. And so we've seen houses open and then close. But that's a huge need right now in our country.
Another thing that often happens is that when someone is rescued, they need to shift locations. They need to get out of the town that they're in.
That's right. And actually, there's a piece to that. It's just a gap in need. There's a lot of gaps, but like foster care, we got some churches and faith communities that have jumped all in with foster care, and they're ready to take people in. But as it pertains to trafficking, you can't take a girl or a boy right off the street and put them right into foster care and have it be effective. It works never. Not because the family's not competent, but because there needs to be this kind of demarcated space where that girl, that boy begins to wrap themselves emotionally and through counseling through what their trauma was, so that when they do enter that home becomes an empowering environment for them, not one they have to flee right away. And so I think once some of these shelters start to take place and we get ours in place, it really puts into play a whole list of other services that our faith community can really help with. But it has to be in its place or it's not very effective.
So this home that you have is designed to house these girls for a time and be a transition place, basically? Is that the way you're thinking of it? Or
yeah. Although I would say it's residential care, so it is intensive. They'll be getting their schooling there. They'll be getting their counseling there. It'll be an intensive, holistic place of healing. But again, if there's trained foster and adoption care families in this field on the backside willing to receive them, it frees up more space for our beds because we can release them into a family environment.
Right.
That frees up more beds. So we don't have any more beds, but we have more opportunity to move them through the process faster with that.
So about how long, roughly speaking, might someone stay in one of these kinds of facilities?
Well, we're looking at a 2 years worth of programming, but in the end, it's somewhat open-ended. It doesn't have to go 2 years, or it might go more than 2 years. When we were in Southern Asia, which is a different context, obviously, but some of the girls had been there 3 and 4 and 5 years, and it's just every person's different.
But it's a pretty long-term operation. I mean, to really cover this, you would need lots of these kinds of places in many ways.
And different types. So there's needs for immediate safe houses. There's needs for, those who are over 18. There's various types of shelters that are needed, and all of them are lacking. But one of the areas where it's most lacking is in that residential care for minors program.
Now, the last letter is empower. So I'm just today I'm learning this. So what's involved in empowerment?
Yeah, obviously the ultimate goal with our organization, or all of us who are people of faith, is that those that are exploited in the end carry the same testimony we do, which is that Christ makes everything new. But there's all sorts of pieces in this empowering process that need to be addressed, and And so we're looking at those next steps, like, how do we help them get plugged in if they're so inclined into scholarships for college to, take those next steps in their education to be nurses and lawyers and doctors and whatever they want to be. Let them dream again as far as what they think they can be, where their identity was so wrapped up in what was being done to them. How do we open their eyes to what the possibilities are? And how do we create an avenue to that being plausible for them? Jobs that bring dignity instead of shame. How do we work with small business owners and entrepreneurs to train these ladies and how to take care? Because some of them have criminal records, that's of no fault of their own. And so when they go put in for employment somewhere, and there's 50 people in this economy that we have that are applying for the same job, where do you think her resume is going to fall in that list of jobs? So we have to create options outside of that structure for entrepreneurial growth, and we've had some major corporations jump in too, knowing they have criminal backgrounds, we're going to create space for a certain amount of jobs that have high mobility for those who are for those we partner with. And we partner with a group called Sabre that does that. They're a Fortune 100 company, works hospitality, Travelocity, other things. So we're looking at, in the Empower piece, to creating options to seeing these girls, these boys move forward in a life of that has hope to it, a hopeful future for themselves.
So someone comes to the end of this sequence, and I take it you've got examples of people who've been rescued out of this, and have they worked their way through free? I mean, have they gotten to the point where they're empowered?
Yeah, there's different areas of that, right? I mean, because we're intersecting with all these girls and boys and families at different levels. Where we're doing direct outreach, obviously we're going to put in place with ourselves and what we have capacity to build in, or other organizations we partner with, each aspect of this process. We've received girls who've been recovered by other groups that need certain help or need to be relocated, that we've brought in. We've tried to get set up even in Las Vegas for work, for employment, for other things, spiritual discipleship, that type of scenario. So we've engaged in all these areas at different levels of the process of their healing. And again, we have great success stories of girls we've worked with who were hurting and are now doing all right. Some of the girls and boys and families we've worked with, or girls and boys, have different things going on that make it an act of love, and we've had to recover multiple times because they're bipolar and they went off their medication and found themselves back. And so it's just an ongoing pursuit with some of them, where oftentimes we get, how many people have you rescued? And it just depends on how you want to define it, right?
Yeah.
It's a matter of, do we count her 5 times because we found her 5 times? Or, at what point during this process of healing do we check them off the list? And I don't think that ever really happens. It's like a community of faith where we're constantly engaged in each other's lives as we move forward to being more like him.
Obviously, there are structural relationships that are a part of this. And I think I want to start here. Someone looks at an organization like yours and they go, I guess that's a church ministry. I can see how you're helping people and restoring dignity and reaching out to people who are vulnerable. There are passages like Proverbs 14:31 that says that the oppression of the poor is an insult to God, but to actually show them favor is to do him honor. Great. So there are texts that support the kind of work that you're doing, but other people will go, well, that sounds kind of social gospel-y. So how do you see yourself? I know you talk a lot about seeing yourself as a mission. So what does that involve?
Yeah, we are a missions organization. We really, I think where God has honored F.R.E.E. and where he's given us favor with all these different agencies that will impact during the course of this segment is we've honored the local church as God's chosen agency to reach the world, small and great alike, said. Whether that's somebody in the boardroom, down the street, a teacher in the school with our kids, or a girl in a legal brothel of Nevada. It's God's people, his church, capital C, and pragmatically local church. As far as effectiveness, that's been tasked at doing that. And so as a missions organization, we've structured F.R.E.E. as not a parachurch. Here we are, we'll do the work, and you guys can root us on from the sideline.
And give your money.
Exactly, give us money, but that we look at the local churches, it has everything it needs Obviously God's bigger than all this to begin with, but even just strategically to reach their community. Even a church of 50 people or 100 people, if we're working with them, they hit every segment of that society. They're truck drivers and educators and policemen and politicians, and all of them are sitting in these churches as a part of a move for the Great Commission to reach this world, the tasking that we have. And so Free International honors that by saying, okay, here's a kind of a specialized group that isn't always easy to see and always easy to interact with, and there's some complications on the backside because of all these things that's been done to them. But how do we empower the local church? But more than how do we empower the local church, we philosophically believe the local church is that agency to do it. So as a missions organization, at the heart of everything we do is obviously the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, our motivation to love happens no matter what a response is on the other side. However, we also realize that we could set the table for all the stuff we talked about in the first segment, but in the end, what does it profit that a person gain the whole world then and still lose their soul? Now, we're not making decisions for people, but we are very honest, not only with the girls we approach, as we build relationship to them, as we interact with them, but also the agencies we partner with, being able to bring the gospel to attorneys general and law enforcement agencies and something. But at the same time, the church has all those people in there. So how do we work with a pastor to create a missional approach to these people's jobs that allow them to be the connection point to the vulnerable through their own church?
So part of your point is that you don't need to reinvent the wheel and create your own organization to make this happen. You just need to utilize the resources that you have available within your church. And if you just have people who are sensitive to what they're capable of because of what they do, the job that they have or whatever, you actually mobilize them. The empowerment, if I can say it that way, happens in two directions. Isn't just empowering the person who's rescued, but you're also empowering a person for this kind of a ministry who says, look, you're in a natural place to be protected. You're a teacher who sees a vulnerable child in your school and you befriend them and give them self-esteem. That's a part of the process.
That's exactly part of the process. And that's really this, I believe, that's why Christ left his church here. If we said a prayer to God and he threw, why didn't he just throw us up into heaven, and say, well done, you finally built a relationship with me, here we go. It's because he wishes none should perish. But to get to some of these people takes a little bit of added help, and it definitely requires collaboration. And like I said, all these sectors are within the church already. So how do we identify it, partner with it, resource it, and empower it to be able to do that through a local church leadership context?
Now, one of the fascinating parts of this, as we've talked about this, is the relationship that you've built with two segments of what I would consider to be civil government. One would be the law enforcement range, and actually we earlier did a podcast with you and Darlene Line, who interestingly enough was just a student in one of my classes who I got to know, and I heard that she was interested in this, and she's the one who made me aware of how much of a problem this is in the United States. And we talked with her, and she did the whole law enforcement angle of what she can and can't do as a law enforcement person and how you all come alongside them. So there's the law enforcement people, but then there's the whole legal side of government as well, the people who discover and in some cases have to prosecute these kinds of cases, et cetera. And you've been very involved with those two groups. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
The fun part about what we do is in building these relationships, we have found, whether it's the governmental side of this, whether it's the legal side of it, or even law enforcement side, that none of those agencies are overall are scared of partnering with the local church. What they fear is not what the church represents. What they fear is that we step outside our boundaries of what we're tasked at doing within culture. So they fear vigilantes. They fear things like that. And so in building relationships, we're able to build trust even among those agencies. A couple times in the last couple of years, I've been able to present to all the attorneys general of the United States of America. And it was based on work we were doing in the faith community, leading efforts around the Super Bowl. But it was in that we would receive individual calls, and still do, from attorneys general saying, how can you help us build relationship with the local church so that we can empower them? There's a government can't end trafficking. They can create laws and structures that allow those who are on the ground to do better at addressing the issue. Law enforcement doesn't have enough resources to go after and to find and to prosecute all the criminals that are working with trafficking. It's the second largest criminal enterprise in the world.
And they can't do any restoration to speak of at all.
And they're not tasked with restoration. That's not their job. And so all of them recognize that this takes more than just their agency to do it. However, it takes a right relationship with that agency. I mean, to us, it's more than just a referral from law enforcement to do the work. To us, it's a relationship to know how to interact, both in outreach and the aftercare side of this, for causing this to happen. And so we have major partnerships with the University of Miami School of Law. They're starting a legal fellowship, the first of its kind, focused on human trafficking, and their only partner in that is F.R.E.E. International, and they know we're a missions organization. They're not scared about that because they know, again, they just want what their best skill set is to be best put out throughout the country. And they're not scared of the faith side of that. And we're honest with that. We've worked with the National Association of Attorneys General. When we do major outreaches, we partner straight up with FBI and state law enforcement agencies. And so even as a missions organization, because of our competency and because we have a right understanding of what they do and what our roles are in right relationship, we see great effectiveness happen through that.
So that's the law enforcement side and the I guess the legal side, and part of what you do is build these relationships and connect, if I can say it this way, this government, these non-church agencies to what's going on, because they're in the middle of all this too. They're in the middle of the same space trying to help people, but they have limits as to what they can do. So in some cases, they're able to hand off some of what they find or discover or come across, and you can pick up the ball from there. Is that their attraction in terms of how they see you operating?
Well, and they can elevate stuff they've seen as effective and promote it, even if it's faith-based. So in the end, if we're talking governmental side of things, they promote us because in the process they look good, because you have a real qualified a way of success on these many girls were recovered, this many missing kids were found, right? When we worked with Class Kids and the Florida Coalition Against Human Trafficking at the Super Bowl in Miami, we worked with Miami Vice. They actually gave us all the missing kids they'd been looking for months. And in 3 days worth of outreach and just roughly about 50 faith-based people out of the churches there, the Miami Vice gave credit for clearing 3 precincts worth of missing kids off the books. And there was numerous minors that were being trafficked that were recovered. It wasn't like it was an uber professional cat and mouse game with the pimps and stuff, which we do. It was a matter of we knew what we were looking for. We had the right information because we had the partnership with law enforcement, and we were given the right platform to get into the areas and do the work. And everyone wins, and that's built over the years for that very reason. So they don't just want to hand something off. Most of these agencies like to take some of the credit for it too, which is fine because all we're doing is building capacity into our outreach for girls and families to be found.
Now, there are 2 stories that we've talked about that we haven't developed. One is we've talked about, when we were prepping for this, and one involved the state of Mississippi, and the other involved an organization called Teen Challenge. So I'm going to let you take those in turn. Let's talk about Mississippi first.
Yeah, I mean, out of the work we did around the Super Bowl in New Orleans, and we as in collaborative, right? So F.R.E.E. International played a role with all this, but there's a couple other great organizations we partner with. We don't do this in isolation. We have them as great partners, Class Kids, which is the National Missing Kids Organization. And it was successful to the point where Mississippi was going, hey, we want to get more involved. And actually, in some ways, they painted themselves in a corner because on the governmental side of things, they were saying, hey, we want to get behind human trafficking. We're going to require all of our agencies to be trained on human trafficking or start the process of training. And so the law passed, so it mandated training. Well, what happens when you make people aware of an issue and they start to see it? People are found. Victims are found. then it's like, well, we don't know
where
what to
go.
do with this.
Yeah.
We didn't think that part
4
through.
beds.
And it wasn't because they were dumb. It's just a matter of you didn't realize how fast you were going to get the response and success you were. So we were called in to talk about that, to go, how can we build capacity in for the so what of this, right? The restoration side. And so we were talking to them. It was going to be a half-hour meeting. It turned into almost a 3-hour meeting. And 3 assistant attorneys general there we were talking to, and they were talking about how do we get the faith-based community involved and this and that. And I began to poke around even in their own lives, and I was like, I bet you guys go to church, don't you? So like, oh yeah, I'm a Sunday school teacher at this evangelical church. I'm a board member. My husband's a board member at this church. And so part of that conversation for me is I needed to get them to realize missionally that we're not talking really 2 separate things here, that God had tasked them in this role to also be the bridge into their own local churches and the faith community to go, hey, we got people in all these areas. Let's start that process of restoration. So in the last couple of months, we have a new couple down in Mississippi that's been tearing it up down there. And over the last few weeks, they've trained over 500 educators in the state. And actually, I was down there a couple months ago with our partner class kids and trained law enforcement, over 200 law enforcement agents in their state. And 11 cases have come out of there, just out of the school system alone from that, that are very young kids, as young as 8 years old. And we're finding out more of how trafficking works in Mississippi because of those stories, which a lot more of that's tied to families rather than pimps. And so when you learn that stuff, you find even more how the church can more engage, because if a bulk of the trafficking is being done by individual families toward their own kids, then how does a church engage in that family structure environment to change how they frame what that's all about?
Now that's Mississippi. What about Teen Challenge?
Yeah, Teen Challenge is a phenomenal organization. In fact, when I first started working with human trafficking in Southern Asia, it was with Bombay Teen Challenge, which is one of the great points of God's transformative power in the world. One of the greatest things I've ever seen. So I love Teen Challenge, but as we referred to in the first segment, Teen Challenge probably wouldn't have been able to exist had they not had these stories of God almost miraculously changing people's lives in a moment at an altar. And groups like F.R.E.E. International probably wouldn't be able to exist, because that whole understanding of this is a social gospel, or this is social work and not the gospel. Teen Challenge, I want to say, prove that different, as though they had something to prove. It's just God moved in a way with that organization to show this wasn't social work. It was, it was God's transformative power working in these unique situations to change lives. Well, with human trafficking, it's a whole different scenario, because again, these children, these people's self-identity is formed early on in their abuse and everything they've got through. They don't know how the world is different than what it is for most people, and how they view themselves in the world. And we've worked with Teen Challenge a lot, but even in the Teen Challenge environment, we've seen a lot of girls that have been trafficked identified through a Teen Challenge structure, because they went there to deal with their addiction. But when the relationships were developed and the stories was told and the Spirit began to move in their lives, come to find out, a lot of what they were in, their drug addiction even, was not a result of good girl gone bad, as much as it was a way to cope with what was being forced on them and their, and the prostitution and all that.
So I take it another. We've talked about attorneys generals. We've talked about law enforcement. I imagine there's a lot of counseling that's involved in all this as well. And how does that connect to what you do?
Yeah, all sorts of counseling that's needed. I mean, we have a new couple joining our team. Counselors, therapists are going to oversee our restore aspect of things. Again, it's one couple, so it isn't like they're going to counsel hundreds of girls that are being rescued around the country, but it's a matter of resourcing even our pastors. I mean, I'll say as a pastor, because I'm a pastor. I'm by DNA, by just by even how I function, and in all the great education I got, even in my Bible college and graduate school work, a lot of these things I was never trained or equipped to deal with.
I didn't hear about this in my 4 years of seminary.
Yeah, and it could broaden out. I mean, 1 in 4 girls will have been sexually molested by the time they hit 18 in our country, and it's 1 in 6 to 7 boys. I've had 88-year-old women in Walker in front of my wife and I weeping because her dad molested her from 8 to 18 years old. When she left the house, she never looked back. God saved her. She was in this church for 70 years. She loved the people in the church, but she never felt she had a safe place to heal from that story. So at 88, for the first time, she had told her story. And so pastors hold the keys in discipleship, but also in the ability to not be the counselors for all these people, but as we're made aware of more of this exploitation in our own churches, how do we bring healing into those situations? We've had so many ladies come to us broken, and not because the pastor or church didn't know what they were doing, but just that this topic became a safe place for them to tell their story. So on the counseling side, I think it's equally as much, how do we counsel trafficking victims? We can draw that back a little more and go, how do we meet the needs of the people in our church who actually are hiding their pain and we don't even know it?
Now, what kind of training is involved, or do you do training for people who say, I'm interested in this area, or are you more directive referral, or is it a combination? Yeah. What goes on?
We do a lot of training, but our training all comes out of the work. So we educate toward engagement is kind of how we do it. So there's a lot of groups out there doing great things, but they're not practitioners. They train, they resource, but it comes out of what they've learned or what they've read, and not out of their practice. And again, I'm not belittling that. I'm just saying we do a lot of training because out of our practice we have real world examples of how it could look in unique environments.
So it's on site, and you go with someone who's in the midst of this, and you just watch them do what they do? Is that, or? Well,
if it's a counseling environment, obviously those people on our team who are licensed and have that expertise will come in and help and resource and train specific to that, that space that the counselor will do. If it's law enforcement, we've trained whole law enforcement agencies in California, and they've received professional credit to be able to do that they need every year. We've trained in hospitals and nursing programs how to identify through the process of intake. We've trained in almost every niche area you can train for credit. Our favorite space is our tribe, the church, though, where we can train in a broader sense, identify where the synergy is between those who want to engage, and then build those specialized trainings out of that original exposure to the issue.
Now, this question just hit me while you were talking, and don't ask me how it came in, but we've talked about the streets being a dangerous place, et cetera. What are college campuses like? Are they a dangerous place for this?
Yeah, we found they're a dangerous place, and obviously a marvelous place to talk about issues that relate to. It's a loaded term. I don't mean this in the political sense, but like social justice or compassion type issues. And so it's a great way to engage future practitioners because they're already going, this is what I want to do with my life, and you can empower it early on and point it the right direction. But there's also a lot of abuse, a lot of rape, a lot of things like that on campuses, a lot of vulnerability. And I don't have any stats to go, hey, this is a cesspool for human trafficking, but there is a vulnerability to a campus environment. Kids are out on their own for the first time, great parenting.
They're in debt.
Parenting. They're in debt. Yeah, all sorts of different vulnerabilities that could come into play. When we've worked major events, we've seen girls who've flown in on their own nickel. They don't have pimps. They're not trafficked, but see their only option is to dance or to do the things to pay for their school. And so they start to make these wrong choices because they're not really seeing the different options. So we got campus clubs called F.R.E.E. University that we've been developing. We've tried to empower the university setting for, again, our expertise and training, so we can come in and train social work departments and things like that, and build a bridge, toward the Christian groups on campus. We let the Christian, just like the church, we think should be leading on a lot of these issues in the public space. In a university space, we like to build bridges to the crew and Chi Alpha and InterVarsity and those different great organizations working on the campus.
Yeah, I have a son who does sports law, and interestingly enough, he's done Title IX work where he's gone into the universities, and he's basically said, are you prepared for situations where sexual abuse is going on, and how do you respond to it, and making sure they're in compliance with Title IX requirement. I thought Title IX was just about sports.
Yeah.
So it's very, very pervasive what we're dealing with. It's in
Absolutely.
all segments of life and in all kinds of corners that you wouldn't even think about. And then the other interesting side that I think you mentioned is that when you're dealing with college-age students who are thinking about their careers, that's another place to encourage people to think about what's the connection between the vocation that you're going into and the possibility of your being able to help in this area.
That's right. And we really emphasize that heavily because we actually have a post-grad program. It's a year-long apprenticeship program to take those who are coming out in their field of expertise, where they work with us in Vegas at some of these major events, but we're missional in that approach. Exactly the stuff we've talked about here. How do we get them to see their vocation missionally, but empower it not only into their own tribe work group that they're going to be with, but how does that translate into the church and the faith community where they can empower that process and that effectiveness. We bring in missions teams all the time from churches and campus groups who come work with us in Vegas for 4 days so we can expose them to the issue, expose them to what it looks like on the ground, and then help them for a day or two, see the skills and the tools we use to engage it in the context of Las Vegas so they can bring that back home and find the right context for that as we consult with them in that process.
Well, Mike, I really do appreciate you coming in and talking to us about this. It's a vast area. It's an area that for a long time was, don't mean the pun, was underexposed, but now has become very public. A lot of people think about it in significant ways. They wrestle with, can I do anything? What's possible? And the idea of this kind of ministry connecting to the local church and drawing on the variety of resources of people seeing their vocation in a way that they can contribute in some way easily is very, very helpful. The idea that college campuses are places where people can get prepared and even create a vision for being able to do these kinds of things. There are lots of ways in which this can work. So we really thank you for coming in and talking to us about what is a topic of need in an area where the church can step in and be of real help.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.